Number 10. Jason Todd's worst fear. Probably one of the most heartbreaking moments for me in recent years in terms of DC Comics happened during Three Jokers, Batman Three Jokers, so pretty recently. I'm still not really sure why people don't like this comic. I thought the story by Jeff Johns and artist Jason Fabok was well worth the multi-year wait myself. It was suspenseful, it was mysterious, and it was just stunning. And honestly, every time I go back to it, I find something new that I like about it. Sure, the middle act in issue number 2 lagged a bit, but otherwise this comic to me was pretty flawless, other than a few minor plot hole issues in my opinion. Also the raccoon. Ah! And despite the lag in issue number 2, it still had one of the most heartbreaking moments for me, which occurred when Jason as Red Hood chose to strike out on his own and ended up finding a pool filled with failed attempts at creating the next Joker, which in and of itself is another kind of brutal. At one point the Three Jokers implied that Jason actually might be the best candidate to become the next Joker, but decide that he's simply not smart enough to take up the mantle. Ouch. Instead, they once more beat him to within an inch of his life with a crowbar, with one of the Jokers, implied to be the Joker who first did this to Jason way back when, commenting on how the second time was even more fun than the first. It gets especially brutal and heart-wrenching when Batgirl and Batman arrive on the scene to rescue him and he lashes out at them, especially when like Babs just comes in and gives him a hug and she's like, I just want to make sure you're safe.
Number 9. The Dark Knight Strikes Again. Batman The Dark Knight Returns came to us originally as a way to give Batman, Bruce Wayne, a fitting end, and it's easily one of the greatest Batman stories out there, with Frank Miller art that was actually understandable and a great tale that wrapped up the character of Batman in a lovely little bow. But then, Frank Miller went and created 2 sequels, and the first of which is basically a fever dream of insanity, overly objectified blocky cartoon women, and just odd visuals, while also taking the character of Superman and completely misunderstanding and disrespecting him. But I think the most egregious moment came when Supes and the third member of the Trinity, Wonder Woman, decided they were going to hook up, right after Batman beat the absolute snot out of the Man of Steel. Wonder Woman comes in to find Superman completely beaten and bloody and ranting about how it's all over, and then, after punching him for being weak, I guess, they immediately start making out. Then they fly up into the stratosphere and begin going at it midair, and then slamming into the ground, causing volcanic eruptions, massive earthquakes, and tsunamis, hurricane-level winds, all for Wonder Woman to say he moved the earth for her. Wow, so poetic. And then she exclaims she is pregnant now, and they decide to get a bite to eat, but they sure are heroic.
Number 8. Jason Todd loves Barbara Gordon? Another really brutal moment, possibly one of my least favorite parts, I think, of Three Jokers, comes at the end. After taking Jason in and helping him to recover after he was attacked, Jason at one point attempts to kiss Barbara. This kind of makes a little bit of sense because, you know, they've got shared trauma, but this felt weirdly forced still and out of place to me because, you know, Babs still seems like she's kind of trying to be there for Jason like a sister. Like, I get that Jason is reaching out because for years he's felt like he was left behind, abandoned, and you know, like I said, they do have shared trauma, but Babs and Jason's relationship has always felt more platonic to me. And if anything, more than that, more familial. Like they were truly, you know, brother and sister. And when Babs reaches out, it's very clear she's coming from this place, and yet Jason seems to struggle to read the room and acts on his romantic feelings anyways, if that's even what's really going on for him. Honestly, I think he's just confused. The third issue ends with a kind of weird note with Jason leaves on her apartment door, and that ends up falling off and then being swept away by the building's janitor, which is especially weird and kind of cringe because it seems to imply, like that whole sequence of shots, that if Babs found it, things may have been different between them. Other than Barbara having to once more reaffirm her boundaries with Jason, I don't see how it could have ended otherwise. What a strange romance subplot that I never expected nor ever really wanted. But hey, there it is.
Number 7. Jericho vs. Vigilante. Okay, so I did talk about this one for brutal villain defeats, but I had no idea this moment happened before, so if we're talking about brutal DC moments we never saw coming, this one for sure hits the mark for me. Joey Wilson, aka Jericho, is the son of the infamous assassin Deathstroke the Destroyer, but despite that fact, Jericho made almost every effort to be a hero, and he was one. He was even a member of the Teen Titans, the team that consistently stands against his own dad. Now Jericho has the ability, granted to him by the same method that granted his dad his abilities, to transfer his consciousness into the body of another using eye contact and take control of them, effectively possessing them. And it was pretty powerful. He could control some pretty strong beings. Unfortunately, every time he did this, a small shred of the individual psyche remained in his head. At first, it was nothing that he couldn't deal with, just 1 or 2 psyches, but over time, possessing multiple people, he He had so many psyches floating through his head that it drove him insane. Now the rogue anti-hero known as Vigilante took on the responsibility of stopping Jericho. And where Vigilante originally planned to just go the quick route and completely end Jericho, Jericho's sister stood firm that her brother was a good person at heart and should not lose his life. Vigilante heard her out and decided to not deal with this threat in a lethal way. Instead, after Jericho was captured and in the back of a police vehicle, Vigilante paid the guy a visit and just completely took Jericho's eyes from his head. It eliminated the threat of Jericho's powers, sure, but I can probably think of a dozen different ways that this course of action could have been averted.
Number 6. Joker's payback. Seriously? The Joker? I mean, what is wrong with this guy? Another horrible moment that haunts me. In fact, this whole story haunts me, not just this one moment, which comes from Brian Azzarello's The Joker. This story follows Johnny Frost, who was tasked with going to pick up the Joker after he's been released from prison. Finally out of the clink, Joker returns to check up on some old friends and old businesses. One of his first stops is a bar and business where Harley Quinn has been dancing while he was away. Not appreciating that Harley has gotten involved in this kind of business, Joker decides to take it out on the man running the establishment by skinning him alive, much to Frost's horror. Although, to be honest, this is really only the beginning and things only get much worse from there, especially from Johnny's perspective.
Number 5. Abandoned at the altar. The wedding of Batman and Catwoman was a big frickin' deal. It was teased at and built up for a long time. Fans were genuinely excited to see it happen and to see what could come next after the fact. A kid of Selina Kyle and Bruce Wayne, what would that be like? We've seen futures where they end up together, but sadly, the wedding that was so coveted never came to be. Batman issue 50 came and went, and following suit, so did Catwoman. Came and went from Bruce's life, literally leaving the groom at the altar. Not like permanently leaving his life, but kind of. Batman was marrying Catwoman so he could literally be happy, and after some convincing words from criminals like the Joker and her friend Holly, Catwoman believed that if Bruce Wayne was happy, then Batman couldn't be Batman, which, 1, that's depressing as hell, but 2, both the Joker and Holly, alongside Riddler, Gotham Girl, Flashpoint, Thomas Wayne, Batman, and other villains, were working for Bane, who was manipulating events in order to break Batman emotionally and give rise to the City of Bane event. Well, it certainly sent Batman down a path of absolute despair. He became much more drastic with his fighting of criminals, particularly an innocent Mr. Freeze, and he even donned a less advanced version of his Batsuit so that he would take more of a beating. Like, come on. Guy's been through enough.
Number 4. The non-canonical made canon. One of the weirdest things with DC is how sometimes they just completely leave their stories open to be in canon or not, kinda depending on how they're received by fans. And one of the weirdest incidents of this happening is with The Killing Joke. The Killing Joke, written by Alan Moore, was never intended by him to be part of the main continuity. And as far as I know, it kinda isn't really, except for one part of the story, the attack on Barbara Gordon, the pain she suffered, and the result of that attack, her becoming paralyzed from the waist down. Why this was the only thing we chose to keep from this story, I do not know, but the whole idea of it just feels super weird, especially when you consider how brutal and graphic this attack was, where Barbara gets no opportunity to defend herself, having been surprised by the Joker's visit while visiting her dad in her civilian form. This element of the story would change Barbara's life forever, and although I do like Babs as Oracle, and I feel like we were able to actually at least turn it into something good, it feels like she was kind of robbed of, you know, some agency here, especially when you consider the story was never really intended to be incorporated into the canon, and it also still kinda wasn't.
Number 3. Maxwell Lord and Ted Kord. I made a rhyme. I think we can all agree that it's incredibly rare to see a mainline superhero taken out of the picture, and if it does happen, it's usually in a huge blaze of glory, or an incredibly tragic moment, or after a long momentous battle with cancer in the case of Marvel's Marvel. So when Ted Kord was erased from existence thanks to a bullet from a barrel at the hands of Maxwell Lord in the Countdown to Infinite Crisis, it kinda sucked. After following Ted the whole book as he struggles for anyone in the Justice League to take him seriously, while he's correctly on the trail of Maxwell and learning of all his misuse of both the Justice League's files, Batman's Brother Eye satellite, and the OMAX, you'd expect Kord to come out surviving, having a cathartic moment where he finally gets the League's respect or to make a dent in Lord's plans, but instead he gets snuffed out like a tea light candle that never even begun to make the wax melt. It's abrupt, brutal, and it made me legitimately very sad to read it.
Number 2. Face Off. One of the most brutal moments that still haunts me to this day, of course, involves the Joker. Because of course he's one of the most twisted and often brutal characters that we have over at DC, I would say. This one comes to us from around the time of Death of the Family. In this story, Joker ended up removing his face in order to reinvent himself. Needless to say, this didn't last forever, but it was a terrifying time, and honestly, I'm not sure how Joker lived after doing this, considering that I'm pretty sure he would have been opening himself up to all kinds of nasty infections. Despite removing his face, Joker would later recover and somehow reapply said face, despite the fact that the face was not well stored in between, cause comics, I guess. Ugh.
Number 1. Fridged. This DC Comics brutal moment caused the whole coining of a term and changed the way comic books were written going forward. Green Lantern Kyle Rayner came home one day after doing his superhero thing in Green Lantern issue number 54 from 1994 to find his then girlfriend, photojournalist Alexandra DeWitt, had been very savagely stripped of her life at the hands of the villain known as Major Force. But not only did Major Force take Alexandra's life, but for seemingly no reason, he also stuffed her into the couple's fridge. It was incredibly brutal and served only to give Kyle, the male antagonist of the story, the motivation to reach new heights as a hero, while her character, who was genuinely likable and could stand on her own, was gone forever. This was a trope in not only comics but media in general, that presented viewers and readers with the idea of sacrificing the female love interest for the direct purpose of motivating the male hero, which practically never happened in the reverse. After this comic came out, the trope was finally given a name: fridging, or women in refrigerators, and it changed the way female characters were written in comics for the most part.
Number 10. Punisher ends the human race. In the one-shot comic, Punisher: The End, we are introduced to a prison that is executing all of its prisoners in preparation for an upcoming nuclear war, with the guards planning on then hiding out in a bomb shelter that is installed. One of the prisoners is actually Frank Castle, who has grown older and has been caught and locked up. He gets in the shelter before the blast comes, and after a year, he and a companion from the prison exit and start making their way through the wasteland. Frank knows that the radiation levels he is exposing himself to will cause him to die within 72 hours, but keeps moving forwards, eventually getting to his goal: a shelter filled with former billionaires who knew their decisions would lead to an apocalypse and hid themselves away. He prepares to punish them, but the sleazy rich people convince him to spare them long enough to explain the seriousness of the situation to him. The other shelters have fallen silent, and they have the means to continue the species, and if Frank ends them, he will also be ending the human race. Frank then mercilessly and brutally murders everyone, including his companion, before walking into the wastelands to die, happy with his decision, believing nothing good ever came from humanity. It is an interesting book, but it leans so far into the mature rating that characters tend to overindulge in an unnecessary amount of slurs and swears, to the point that it actually somehow makes the whole thing feel more childish than many standard Marvel comics. Number 9. Deadpool Killustrated. The sequel to the first Deadpool Kills the Marvel Universe features Deadpool trying to destroy the Marvel Universe by going into other fictional stories that inspired the Marvel heroes in order to prevent any of them from being created. Over the course of the miniseries, we see Deadpool brutally dispatch such classic characters as Don Quixote, the Little Mermaid, Tom Sawyer, the siblings from Little Women, Moby Dick, and the Three Musketeers, while he's pursued through the Ideas verse by a team of heroes led by Sherlock Holmes. If you're a fan of these classic characters, it can be really brutal to suddenly see them eviscerated as they scream and cry, asking why this is happening, but the sheer stupidity of it obviously makes it pretty funny. The humor cuts some of the brutality, making this rank pretty low on the list. Number 8. Scramble Gets Free. This next entry is dedicated to one of our commenters, Kevin Hawkins, who has asked that I keep teaching him about Canada's super team, Alpha Flight, so that he can continue to learn about more obscure superheroes in order to help him expand his rather narrow tastes. Sure thing, Kevin, I'll keep the Alpha info coming. The original Alpha Flight series had its fair share of brutal moments, but one that has always stuck in my mind is from issue 30, when Heather accidentally releases Madison Jeffries' evil brother, Lionel, otherwise known as Scramble. Scramble has the mutant power to rearrange organic matter. He originally originally used this power as an army medic in the Vietnam War, but the trauma of the war drove him insane and he was locked away in a hospital. Once he got free, he used his powers to turn the other patients into deformed and grotesque mounds of mutated flesh that then attacked the heroes. Every design in this issue is wonderfully brutal and disgusting, including the creature that Heather is transformed into. The victims are eventually saved and put back in their original shapes, which makes this a bit less brutal, but it was an especially disturbing issue. Number 7. Thanos Rising. Thanos Rising is a mini-series that explores the origins of one of Marvel's most iconic villains, Thanos the Mad Titan. It starts with him as a child, and explores his early courtship with Death, who keeps manipulating him into situations that cause Thanos to kill. At first he is taking out lizards that hurt his friends, but this soon escalates into him capturing classmates in order to dissect them to see what is wrong with him in comparison to others. He insists that all the death is just a means to an end, but eventually admits that he has grown to enjoy it. This solidifies when he decides to capture and dissect his mother so that he can continue to find out why he is different, showing no remorse or care for his actions. It is a brutal origin for the character, and honestly, for a character as twisted as Thanos, nothing else would have sufficed. Number 6. Deadpool kills his parents. Part of the original Sin comics, Deadpool Volume 5 Issue 34 features a twisted tale from the Merc with the Mouth's past. It takes place in the 90s and is drawn in a style that reflects that. In this story, we see Deadpool in his early days as a brainwashed assassin. His handler decides to test how deeply they have Wade under their control and sends him and Sabretooth to his childhood home with the mission of ending the lives of his own parents. Wade doesn't have much memory of his past and eagerly goes for the house, but he is stopped from attacking his parents. Kevin, you are never gonna guess who stops him. It's 90s Alpha Flight, who I'm honestly surprised haven't crossed paths with Deadpool more often. The two teams fight, and Sabretooth and Deadpool manage to get away, their mission a failure. The jovial tone of the book then takes a sharp turn as Deadpool grabs a drink, returns to his childhood home, and silently takes a tour of the strange and familiar sights before setting the house on fire and getting into the car with Sabretooth without a word. The fact that the book is so lighthearted before this moment makes the final blow so much more brutal. Number 5. Hulk, The End. While I found Punisher, The End to be kinda bad and immature despite trying really hard to be mature, I really like the Hulk, The End story. In this book, the world has come to an end after a nuclear war, and all of humanity has died off, save Bruce Banner, who is now over 200 years old. He wanders the world by himself, wanting to die, but being unable to, as the Hulk wants to continue being the strongest one there is. The only creatures that have survived are giant mutated swarms of bugs, who chase and devour the Hulk, always leaving him a mutilated mess on the ground before leaving him to heal. This continues for years until Bruce realizes that he is the modern Prometheus, who brought fire to the people of Earth from the gods and was punished by being left alone to be consumed by birds. Bruce finally passes, leaving the Hulk to wander the wasteland completely alone for all time. Number 4. Marvel Zombies, Dead Days. In Marvel Zombies, we are shown a world where all of the Earth's heroes have been transformed into flesh-eating zombies who are trying to find more humans to consume to sate their seemingly unending appetite. In the one-shot comic Dead Days, we are shown the last days of the human race, as well as our favorite heroes becoming the cruel monsters we know from Marvel Zombies. There are some brutal and disturbing moments, such as Spider-Man turning and eating Mary Jane. Okay, Kevin will appreciate this. We get to see the zombified Alpha Flight attacking the X-Men after having ate Professor X before they are graphically dispatched by Magneto. We also get to see She-Hulk eating Val and Franklin Richards before having her head blown off by Sue Storm. Every page is more disturbing than the last, but I think the worst part is when Reed Richards decides that zombies are actually the next step in evolution and infects the other Fantastic Four members and then allows them to feed on him and turn him as he smiles. Number 3. Civil War. For anyone only familiar with the movie adaptation of Marvel's Civil War, the reasons behind the Superhero Registration Act are a bit different, and much more awful. The story begins with the superhero team The New Warriors about to raid a home in Stamford, Connecticut, where a group of supervillains are hiding out. The New Warriors were filming a reality show and were being extremely careless when they attacked the villains. The resulting fight led to the villain Nitro and Namorita fighting in front of a school full of children. Nitro then exploded, wiping out the school and the surrounding area. Hundreds of civilians, most of the villains, and most of the heroes all died as a result. It is a rough way to start off the book and really does a good job of setting up the moral quandary at the heart of the story. Number 2, Ruins. You guys were super helpful with recommendations in the comments in part 1, and a lot of the entries on this list are from there, so thank you. One of the ones I wasn't familiar with that a lot of you mentioned was Marvel Ruins, and you were right. It's a rough one. Marvel Ruins is a 2-part mini-series that essentially asks the question of what would the Marvel Universe be if instead of accidents resulting in heroes getting powers, they just got sick and died. For example, in this universe, Matt Murdock saved the old man from getting hit from the truck, and the radioactive goop that got in his eyes caused him to die in the hospital without growing up and becoming Daredevil. Wolverine has a painful bone disease. Captain America introduced Nick Fury to cannibalism at some point. Jean Grey is a teenager selling herself on the street before being killed by Fury, who then takes his own life. Okay, Kevin is gonna be so thrilled. We even get a brief look at Alpha Flight's Aurora and North Star, who are homeless, naked, and starving on the streets. Everything is awful. But my favorite bit comes from issue 2, where it is revealed that when Peter Parker was bitten by the radioactive spider, it gave him a deadly and contagious radiation disease that is spreading among the population. The book is relentless. There's not really much of a story thread other than what if everything sucked? And it answers that question in great and brutal detail. Number 1, the death of the X-Men. The Old Man Logan story takes place on an Earth where the villains finally got organized and teamed up to take over the world, under the command of the Red Skull. The book is filled with disturbing ideas and moments, such as Hulk having an evil gang of Hulk children with his cousin She-Hulk, but the worst in my opinion is how the villains took out the X-Men on the night they came to power. Wolverine was monitoring the situation with Jubilee when the X-Mansion was suddenly attacked by supervillains. As the children fled, Wolverine made a brave final stand against the bad guys, cutting them down one at a time until there were none left. It was then that Mysterio revealed that the whole thing had been an illusion, and Logan had been attacking his own teammates the entire time. I don't think it gets worse than that. Although, I can picture it happening to Adam here at Top 10 Nerd. Number 10, Batman. Batman is perhaps the poster boy for miserable superheroes. When he was a child, he of course saw his parents die in front of him, causing him to vow to protect Gotham City from crime as Batman. Batman has witnessed many tragedies during his time in the Cowl, and has had his fair share of horrible things happen to him, such as losing one of his sons, Jason, as well as his father figure and faithful butler, Alfred. He has also had to deal with several horrible injuries, such as being repeatedly shot and stabbed, and having his back broken. He also got left at the altar on his wedding day, which was not great for his mental health, I'm sure. Despite being a character who is very much defined by what he has lost, he has probably gained more over the years. He has a massive family of both biological and adopted children, and has an extensive collection of allies and friends. On top of this, most of the things that he has lost have come back to him over the years. He lost Jason Todd, but he returned to life. The same thing happened when he lost Damian Wayne or Stephanie Brown. Out of all the major losses, the only ones that have stuck are his parents and Alfred. And let's face it, Alfred coming back is only a matter of time. Batman's life is better than he lets on. And he's probably just depressed, which is why he's at the bottom of this particular list. Number 9, Angel. Warren Worthington III was one of the original X-Men, having giant bird wings that allowed him to fly as Angel. He spent years as a hero until the Mutant Massacre. He was captured by the Marauders, who then cut off his wings and crucified him. This caused him to spiral into an awful depression, which eventually led to him trying to take his own life. This was prevented when Apocalypse showed up and made Angel an offer. He would give him back his wings if Angel would become one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, the Archangel of Death. This got him his wings back, but caused a host of other problems, with him having to work to resist the evil force that was put inside him ever since. Number 8. Scarlet Witch. Wanda Maximoff has gone back and forth between hero and villain during her many years at Marvel Comics, with her being responsible for a lot of horrible things that have happened, such as the infamous No More Mutants thing, but that is not to say that she hasn't had a somewhat tragic life herself. Things didn't get off to a good start when she was kidnapped from her mother as a baby by the High Evolutionary who experimented on her to give her powers. While staying with old HE, a demon named Chthon chose her to be his vessel, trying to possess her multiple times. She tried to put out a fire in her village with her powers, and people assumed that she was the one who started it and attacked her. This led to her being saved by Magneto and joining the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. She eventually became an Avenger and married her teammate Vision. She used her powers to create a pair of twin boys for her to raise. This made reality unstable, and Wanda was forced to give them up, and they faded from existence. This led her down a dark road where bad stuff continued to both happen to her and because of her. She has had a far from easy life. Number 7. Spider-Man. Spider-Man lost his parents when he was a young boy, and he was sent to live with his aunt and uncle. When he developed spider powers, he chose not to stop a criminal who went on to kill his Uncle Ben, and as a result, he became a superhero with a guilt complex named Spider-Man. Spider-Man has certainly had his fair share of losses with his parents, his uncle, and his first great love, Gwen Stacy, who got thrown off a bridge and died from whiplash when Peter tried to catch her with a web line. He's had some major wins as well though, having dated some of the most absurdly attractive women in comics and getting married to his perfect partner, Mary Jane Watson. Although, this was undone in a deal with a demon in order to save Peter's Aunt May. Since then, it's been a downward spiral, with Marvel editorial seemingly being unwilling for Peter to grow as a person. They let him and Mary Jane become pregnant, but then made the child a miscarriage at the last minute. They undid his marriage, they made him the head of a big company which he then lost. He became a teacher but was fired. It seems like any time he's about to move into a new era, something happens that makes him single, broke, and taking pictures of himself for the Bugle for money. He has a less intense series of losses than a lot of the others on this list, but it's just a constant stream of pain and anguish for the poor guy. Sometimes to the point that it doesn't even make sense. He recently broke up with Mary Jane, and 6 months later, she's with some guy named Paul, and some kids are calling her mommy. Spider-Man is known for having a rough life, but Marvel needs to let him be happy for a bit, just for something different. Number 6. Daredevil. Daredevil is another character who almost notoriously can't seem to catch a break. When he was a child, Matt Murdock was in an accident that caused a radioactive isotope to get in his eyes, blinding him. It also gave him heightened senses and amazing abilities, but life wasn't through with him yet. His father was a boxer who refused to throw a fight, for which he was killed, leaving Matt with no family to speak of. He became Daredevil as well as a lawyer, but it has been far from an easy gig. One of his loves, Elektra, was killed by the villain Bullseye. As if that wasn't bad enough, Bullseye would later end the life of Matt's other great love, Karen Page. Speaking of Karen, she was an addict who sold Daredevil's secret identity for a fix, which allowed the Kingpin to systematically destroy Matt's life. It eventually got back on track, and Elektra eventually returned to life, but Matt has had to deal with his secret identity getting leaked constantly, getting possessed by a demon that made him murder people, being sent to prison multiple times, and having an almost constant tension with the people who care about him. On top of all of that, he has massive Catholic guilt, which just makes everyone feel worse. Number 5. Martian Manhunter. Martian Manhunter's life since he came to Earth has been pretty good, all things considered, but his backstory is just so brutal that it earns him a spot on this list. John Jones was born on the planet Mars, where he lived with his wife and daughter. This idyllic life came to an end when John's evil twin created a virus that made Martians burst into flames when they used their psychic powers. Due to this virus, John had to watch his wife, his child, and everyone he ever knew burst into flames. When a scientist on Earth attempted to make contact with Mars with the use of a transmitter, it instead transported John to Earth, where he became the hero, Martian Manhunter. He has handled the loss incredibly well, but losing everyone you ever knew in one of the most painful and brutal ways possible is simply a terrible way to live. Number 4. Guardian. James James Hudson of Alpha Flight has had a rough go of it. He was raised by a single mother after his father was killed in a knife fight when he was just a child. He never wanted to be a superhero, but after he developed the Alpha Flight program and its chosen leader, Wolverine, left, he had no choice but to step up. His suit's power pack overloaded in Alpha Flight 12, causing him to light on fire in front of his wife and for him to be presumed dead. He was actually transported to a different planet 10,000 years in the past. The alien inhabitants tried to repair him, but confused his power suit for part of him and turned him into a cyborg before putting him in cryosleep and sending him back to Earth. He returned after having been gone for 2 years and was reunited with his wife. Less than 10 issues later, he was forced to sacrifice his life in order to fight Galactus and was considered dead again. He was actually found and captured by the evil Master and brainwashed into becoming a villain against his old team. He overcame this and was finally free to live his life, until he discovered an evil plan from the government and his suit was sabotaged to send him to deep space, making everyone think he was dead again. The government made a younger clone of him that began dating his wife until Hudson came back, only to discover that his wife had broken up with his clone and was now dating his teammate Puck. The clone later died and he was able to win Heather back, and the two had a child. But on the day she was born, a rogue government employee who wanted Heather for himself shot James out of the sky, causing him to break every bone in his body and almost die again. Wolverine gave him a transfusion that helped to heal him, and he was free to live his life, until him, his wife, and his team were killed by the Collective, leaving his daughter to be raised by distant relatives. He and Heather came back to life, but their dangerous lifestyle caused the courts to refuse them custody. Heather was brainwashed by the Master into being a villain, and she killed her relatives to get her baby, causing her to become a wanted fugitive with his child. He eventually tracked them down and put them in a hollow prison where they could be safe and not hunted, but his wife made it clear that she was still leaving him. So for those counting, he's died like 5 times, and every time he comes back to life, his life actually gets way worse than it was before. Number 3, the Hulk. Even before he became the Hulk, Bruce Banner led a pretty miserable life. His father was a violent drunk who would hurt Bruce and ended up killing his mother in front of the young boy. He threatened Bruce until he lied in court, saying that his father didn't do it, but after Brian drunkenly boasted about the crime, he was put in a mental institution. Bruce spent his childhood suffering from mental health issues, and 15 years later, Brian was released into Bruce's care. While visiting his mom's grave on Christmas Eve, Brian attacked Bruce and Bruce pushed him, causing him to crack his head open and die because of the gravestone. Bruce repressed this memory and grew up to be a great scientist. While testing his gamma bomb, Bruce realized that a teenager had wandered onto the test site and got him to safety, getting caught in the blast himself. This changed him so that whenever he became angry, he would transform into the Hulk, a giant green rage monster. He has spent much of his life since then constantly on the run and being hunted like an animal by the US military. Even when he manages to be a hero for a while, it's never long before someone decides he's too dangerous and needs to be taken out. Bruce lives a life on the run with nothing of his own, not even the clothes on his back, which he loses when he transforms. He has managed to develop a support system like his wife and Rick Jones, but between the multiple personalities and the constant battle with supervillains, he has led a pretty rough life. Number 2, Deadpool. Wade Wilson was a Canadian who moved from Canada and joined the Special Forces in the US, and later became a CIA until he fell in love with the mutant Vanessa Carlyle. Things were good for a while until he developed 34 inoperable cancerous tumors. He left Vanessa and returned home to die. He was recruited into the infamous Weapon X program and given a healing factor which caused the cancer cells to multiply, leaving him hideously disfigured. He was sent to a facility for hospice where the villain Ajax tortured him until Wade escaped and became a mercenary again. He was driven insane from all of this and became the Deadpool we all know and love today. Although he can heal from any injury, Wade is constantly put through the ringer, being given some of the worst physical damage and torture that anyone could endure. He has trouble getting other heroes to respect him or treat him well, and had to give up his daughter because he felt that being around her would only put her in danger. He has a good heart, but there are few superheroes who have endured the amount of pain Deadpool has. Well, except of course, number 1, Wolverine. Wolverine was originally James Howlett, a Canadian living in the late 1800s. When he was a young screaming boy, his groundskeeper killed his father and tried to kidnap his mother. His mutation manifested at this moment, with him popping bone claws, which he used to kill the attacker. Turned out, the groundskeeper was his real father, and his mother sent him away before taking her own life with a shotgun. And it just gets worse from there. Wolverine has lived a long life and therefore has seen almost everyone he's ever loved die, including his wife Itsu and Jean Grey multiple times. He spent many years traveling the world until he was subjected to the experiments of the Weapon X program, who gave him his trademark metal claws. In the years after this, he fought many foes and was subjected to pretty much any injury you can think of, be it having his metal skeleton pulled out or being run over by a steamroller. In a more recent example of his terrible life, he was forced to fight a group of killers who were after him called the Mongrels. He killed all of them before he was informed that every member of the team had actually been one of his children that he had conceived during his wandering years. Rough, dude.
Number 10. Taskmaster vs. Hyperion. This one is wild, especially when you consider the beating that Taskmaster was allowing himself to take just to get this fight done. And yet he did manage to get it done, and impressively so. We get to learn about how he actually had this one in the bag through flashbacks we are shown during the fight, where it's revealed that Taskmaster's preparation was the key. Now, it might seem weird that I'm considering Taskmaster to be the hero in this case, but based on what we learn about Phil Coulson's Squadron Supreme in the 2021 Heroes Reborn event, and that whole thing with Mephisto, it really does make sense based on that. In the Taskmaster series in issue number 2, Taskmaster is working with Nick Fury to clear his name, but Tony Masters has to do something for Fury first. He needs to collect the kinesic signatures of 3 important individuals, one of whom is Phil Coulson. But to get to him, he has to go through Hyperion. And in order to do that, he has to first bring Hyperion's guard down, in essence allowing Hyperion to punch his way through Taskmaster. Ouch. Taskmaster, through feigning a loss though, is able to get Hyperion to drop his guard enough to get a single, powerful boomerang arrow shot out. A Hawkeye classic that is tipped with Hyperion's one weakness based on Fury's intel: radioactive Argonite, which is basically like Hyperion's like kryptonite, so yeah. Number 9. Dream vs. Karanzan. One of my favorite fights I've ever read in any book, comic, or otherwise happens in the Sandman series, where many of my favorite things happen in comics because it's one of my favorite stories of all time. If you've watched my videos on Nerd Here regularly over the years, you may also know that this comic is one of my favorite stories of all time because anytime I can talk about it, I love to talk about it. The original comic, of course, from the 90s is what we're talking about here, and the fight that happens in it happens during the first arc in the series when Dream is tasked with reclaiming his symbols of office, namely here his helm, which it turns out is currently in the possession of a demon in hell. In order to get back his helm in the comics, he must do battle with and beat the demon currently in possession of it, one of Beelzebub's, a demon named Karanzan. This battle is described as being the oldest game, and is in essence a battle of imagination. One can lose through hesitation, inability to take up a solid defensive stance, and of course, lack of imagination. In the Sandman live action series, this is the battle we see that takes place instead between Lucifer and Dream. However, in the comics, it is Karanzan that conjures up the anti-life in the hopes of finally beating Dream. While initially Dream is badly beaten by Karanzan's move, he ends up winning in the end, proving himself really the ruler of imagination, as what else are dreams really, by conjuring up the concept of hope, which obviously can be pretty much everything. Some people might not consider Lord Morpheus a superhero, but I would consider his tale overall to be one similar to that of a heroic epic. And for that reason, and his capacity to do great good when he so chooses, I'm gonna include him here. Number 8. Moon Knight vs. Raoul Bushman. So many of the most brutal fights in comics I feel like come from the time period that this comic does, the early 2000s. One of the most edgy times other than the 90s. In Moon Knight issue number 2 from the 2006 volume, Moon Knight takes on and brutally defeats Raoul Bushman. But even before we get to the brutal yet victorious literal face-off moment, stakes are established here, with Moon Knight being pushed off of a rooftop and falling to his doom, or seemingly falling to his doom, smashing his knees as he goes, and therefore unable to get up to defend himself really when Bushman comes down to finish the job. Fortunately, Moon Knight has his crescent moon darts, and uses these to bring Bushman down to his level so he can crawl over to him and finish the job. Number 7. Black Panther vs. Namor. Probably one of the most brutal fights I've ever seen on screen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe comes to us from the recent Black Panther sequel, Wakanda Forever. That's right, we're going to the MCU, baby! In this film, it is T'Challa's sister Shuri who takes up the mantle of Black Panther after her brother passes away, which was changed in the script after the real-world death of Chadwick Boseman, who initially played Black Panther, Prince turned King T'Challa in the first film and in the MCU. Shuri here takes up the mantle as a last resort to reconnect with the family she has lost, but also because she knows it is the only way she will be able to fight against the newly introduced and complex antagonist in this movie, Namor, the Submariner, or Namor if you prefer. I love the way that it's said in this movie, Namor. When the two do come to blows after Shuri does successfully recreate the heart-shaped herb and becomes Black Panther, Shuri also uses her smarts to take advantage of Namor's weaknesses, creating a device to dry him out, which she places in one of her ships and activates during the fight against the famed Talokan. During the fight, the airship crash lands on a desert-looking beach. It looks real crispy down there, I gotta say. And the two continue their bloody fight, both almost dying as Shuri attempts to prevent Namor from getting back into the water. Through the course of their fight, Black Panther rips off one of Namor's ankle wings, which allows him to fly, and Namor at one point skewers her with a part of the wreckage. Or a spear, I'm not really sure what it is. It looks like a spear, but he also kind of grabbed it from where like the wreckage was. Maybe there were spears on the ship, who knows. Number 6. Thor vs. Kull Borson. Also known as the Serpent and the God of Fear, Kull Borson is actually Thor's uncle, but that didn't stop these two from fighting one another. In fact, their fight was in essence destined to happen. It had to happen, and Thor was fated to die in this battle against his uncle. Odin had attempted to keep Thor safe from this prophecy by locking Kull away years ago. Kull was once actually the rightful ruler of Asgard, the Allfather, but Odin was forced to overthrow his brother after Kull became obsessed with striking fear into both the hearts of his enemies and even kind of his allies. Odin locked Kull away deep beneath the sea, hoping to keep him from ever becoming powerful enough to rise again after he learned that the serpent was prophesied to kill his son. However, even doing this cannot prevent the prophecy from coming to pass. Eventually, Kull would rise up, powered by the fears of the people of Midgard, and choose his own champions, awarding them great power and each their own hammer. Thor would learn the truth of his uncle and with the Avengers do battle against him and his army, dying as predicted in the fight against his uncle, but fortunately defeating him too. However, this is also comics, so both Kull and Thor would eventually return despite their epic showdown and its seemingly permanent results. Number 5. Harley Quinn vs. the Joker. While some still might think of Harley Quinn as a villain, this all happened, I would say, around the time of her turning point from kind of villain into hero. This is kind of when it's all going down. And while the road has been long, I would say at this point in time, at the time of this recording right now, despite only a few years before being declared Villain of the Year, that Harley is more hero than villain right now in her history. So yeah. This fight happened, however, quite a while ago now, but Harley was still enjoying acting somewhat heroically, at least, as part of the Suicide Squad, and coming into her own really as a character, or continuing to come into her own, I would say. In Suicide Squad issue number 15, she faces off with the Joker in one of the most brutal fights I have ever read. And while the Joker technically kind of wins this fight, Harley wins the battle, managing to escape with her life after he locks her up and threatens to leave her there to starve to death with all the corpses of the supposed Harleys who came before her. There is so much about this fight that I cannot talk about in detail because we're on YouTube, but just trust me, it's just because it's also literally that brutal. So if you want to read a brutal fight, check it out. Number 4. Spider-Man vs. Green Goblin. This one ended in seeming death for both parties, and it doesn't get more brutal than that. Add in the fact that Peter Parker was also unmasked during the fight and had his loved ones and neighborhood watching him get basically beaten into oblivion, and it creates a pretty intense picture in your mind and in your heart. Or, well, yeah, I mean, you don't even really need to create a picture of it in your mind because this comes from the Ultimate Comics, and of course, they provide the pictures for you because it's a comic book. And what a brutal picture they do paint. This fight isn't just brutal in a physical sense, although it is also that, with Peter smashing a hulking Green Goblin with basically a semi-truck at one point, but it's also brutal in the emotional sense, because it ends with Peter's apparent death. And I mean also Goblin's apparent death. But of course, I'm much less broken up about Green Goblin dying here. No one cares. Norman, you deserved it. In fact, I kind of feel relieved at that part. While this wouldn't be the end for either character, this battle is still one that stands out to me as one with heightened stakes, where the characters feel right on the precipice of death almost throughout, until they actually and tragically cross over to the other side. Number 3, Batman vs Superman, an iconic fight in the comics that made its way to the big screen. Granted, on the big screen, I don't know how iconic this fight was for me, but at the end of the day, the fact that it even made it there just goes to show the impact it had on readers. This fight doesn't even come from the main continuity, hailing instead from Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns continuity of Earth 31. But it was so brutal and impactful that it was still incorporated into the main continuity, or the likely, I guess, to be former main continuity of the DCEU. Here, two heroes fight against one another, and one of them doesn't even have any powers to speak of. Batman at this point is not only still powerless, but is also, or I guess was also, retired. He returns from retirement, however, and as a result, Superman is basically tasked with taking him out by the President. But Batman isn't prepared to go down without a fight, and a bloody, brutal, and desperate battle ensues between the two at the end of the story that we later find out Batman seemingly won in his own sly Batman way. While Batman seemingly dies and is unable to finish the fight, with the strain being too much on his heart and him collapsing, we later learn at the funeral that he is still alive and well, and that Clark may have even been in on this ploy. At the very least, he seems to be in on it by the end of the story. Number 2, Hawkeye vs the Liberators. As you'd expect, this list wouldn't be much without me diving into the world of the Ultimates. And what a perfect time for it too, as the Ultimate line is due to make its return in comics this year. There's so many brutal fights in the Ultimates, with Jonathan Hickman heading the return of the Ultimates line. Like many, I too am excited about this, so I thought why not dive back into some of the most brutal Ultimates fights we've ever witnessed. This one comes to us from before Jonathan Hickman's time working on the line, but was delivered to us by the dynamic and often brutal duo of Mark Miller and Brian Hitch. And Brian Hitch will be returning, so fun facts. It does fit right in on this list because it's just that brutal. The fight happened after Hawkeye of the Ultimates team was kidnapped by the Liberators. After learning of what happened to his family and being mocked, tormented, and questioned, Hawkeye finally manages to strike back against his captors with the only weapon he has at the time, his fingernails. And we're not talking about Clint clawing his way out of this. Oh no, we're talking about him using his fingernails as projectiles when combined with his deadly accuracy, which basically allow him to take out an entire group of Liberators and successfully escape. He kills people with his fingernails. Number 1, Mera vs Aquaman. Mera and Aquaman are often presented as being romantic partners, and sometimes as a crime-fighting Atlantean duo as well. However, this doesn't mean that they never fight. And during the Blackest Night, they actually had some pretty good reason to. At that time, Aquaman had been possessed by the Black Lanterns, joining their forces, and Mera was driven into a rage by the death of the last standing family member she had, Tempest, causing her to become a Red Lantern. During one page in Green Lantern issue number 50 from the 2005 volume of that series, Mera takes on the deceased Arthur Curry, and when he attempts to win her over through what I can only describe as weird kind of empathy, I imagine trying to distract her from her rage by attempting to bond with her over the loss of their son. This, however, fails to work, and Mera frightens him off masterfully, responding, "I never wanted children," before seemingly killing them both with her blood, which as a Red Lantern was transformed at the time into liquid napalm, because that's how it be for Red Lanterns.
Coming in at number 10 is Zur-En-Arrh. The Batman of Zur-En-Arrh was introduced in 1958's Batman number 113 as Tlano, who protects a faraway planet in a red, yellow, and purple Batman-inspired suit. While a dazed Batman pilots the Batplane over Gotham City one night, he finds himself transported to the world of Zur-En-Arrh by Tlano. Bruce helps Tlano fight off alien invaders with Superman-like powers, and it's transported back to Earth. Now, fast forward to Grant Morrison's run on Batman, and the whole adventure was revealed to be a hallucination caused by an isolation experiment on Bruce Wayne by the villain Dr. Simon Hurt, with Zur-En-Arrh being derived from Bruce Wayne mistaking his father's last words, Zorro in Arkham, the film they had just watched before his parents were brutally snatched away from him. Using the trigger phrase, Dr. Hurt broke Bruce's mind and left him on the streets of Gotham. However, Bruce had developed a backup personality to bring the fight back to Dr. Hurt, the much more violent Batman of Zur-En-Arrh. And at number 9 is Batman White Knight. Batman White Knight does something rather unique. It takes the arch enemy of Batman, the Joker, and flips him to become the hero of Gotham, but not one that wears a mask or runs around beating up criminals in the night. A hero who stands in the public eye and fights for what's right. Mostly. The story really paints Batman out to be as brutal and terrifying as he tries to be, and it's pretty successful. The best example I can give is how the Joker actually became reformed in the first place. In the very first issue of the comic, Batman is chasing Joker alongside Barbara Gordon, Batgirl, and Nightwing, and he is single-minded, driving the Batmobile over people's roofs and through active construction zones, barging past security guards who just want to help. Normally Batman is pretty good at not letting the Joker talk him into a frenzy, but this time it ain't gonna go that well. When Joker torments Batman, then reveals he is taking a new medication to cure his mental illness, Batman snatches the whole bottle and in front of a large group of onlookers, he empties the whole bottle into the Joker's mouth and forces him to swallow it. Number 8. Bane. There are many deranged and off-the-wall villains in Batman's rogues gallery, and while the Dark Knight has suffered losses and defeats at the hands of a few, none of those defeats are as infamous as the ones he suffered at the hands of Bane. By issue 11 of the Broken Bat part of the Nightfall arc, Bane had managed to find out that Bruce Wayne was indeed Batman. Bane surprised Bruce at his home, pumped himself with venom, and laid a brutal beatdown on the Dark Knight in his own home. The fight continued on into the Batcave, and completely taken by surprise, Batman is on his last legs when the venom-fueled tank of a man lifted Batman over his head and dropped him spine first onto his massive back-breaking knee. This brutal move, captured in one of the most iconic comic panels ever, put the Batman completely out of commission, requiring him to choose another to fill his role as the protector of Gotham until he could make his triumphant return. Coming up at number 7, Alfred. Bane broke the Dark Knight's back all the way back in Nightfall, but I think it was his attempt to break Batman's spirit that was the most despicably brutal moment for this character. After Flashpoint Batman organized a takeover of the city of Gotham, Batman and his Bat family were forced out of the city. Its perimeter was guarded and Alfred Pennyworth was taken as a hostage. In an attempt to rescue Alfred, Batman sent Damian Wayne Robin. Unfortunately, Damian was not quite capable of getting the job done, but that doesn't mean that he deserved to be forced to watch as Bane snapped the neck of Alfred Pennyworth, sending the heart of the Bat family to his grave. Instead of actually serving to break the Batman spirit like he intended to, Bane actually pushed Batman to do practically whatever it takes to put Bane down. If anything, this act united the Bat family as a force to be reckoned with, and there was no way Bane or the alternate Thomas Wayne were going to get away with this heinous crime. And at number 6 is his one rule. Batman Hush could in its entirety be seen as a brutal moment. It strikes at the childhood life of Bruce Wayne himself, pushing Batman to a point we rarely ever see. In Batman issue number 614, right smack dab in the middle of the Hush story arc, Tommy Elliot, the childhood friend of Bruce Wayne, loses his life at what seems to be the hands of the Joker. All the years and years of distress caused by the Joker, the people hurt, the lives lost, they all fuel this rage inside of Bruce Wayne, who begins to lay a spectacular beatdown on the Joker, knocking out both Harley Quinn and even Catwoman, who both try to stop him. Batman almost goes to the point of permanently bringing an end to the Joker, beginning to put aside his morals to finally be rid of this homicidal plague on Gotham City. It's not until Jim Gordon intervenes while Batman has his gloves around the Joker's neck that the Dark Knight finally relents. The worst part is that if Batman did go through with it, the Joker wasn't even the one responsible for the crime he thought he was responsible for. Number 5, The Heretic. The 2012 volume of Batman Incorporated is full of some just bizarre moments. This is happening at a time when Batman has taken on his newfound son, Damian Wayne, as his Robin. Their relationship is strenuous at best. It's bound to happen when the dad is a brooding, unemotionally available masked man who runs around beating up criminals, and the surprised son, who was raised to be one of the deadliest assassins in the world, is dumped on Batman by a woman who had chemically manipulated him into conceiving the kid in the first place, if you know what I mean. While these two were trying to find a balance in their relationship, Talia al Ghul, the aforementioned mother, initiated a plot to take over Gotham alongside her organization and with a massive hulking bodyguard called the Heretic. Spoilers for a story that is about 10 years old, but the Heretic is actually a clone of Damian Wayne himself, and he is terrifying. For starters, he was literally grown inside the belly of a whale, which, what? But in some of his most brutal moments, Heretic ties a group of hostages to a massive boulder and then throws the boulder down a flight of stairs. He quite literally single-handedly takes the life of Knight and fights off members of Batman Incorporated using the hero's body as a weapon. But when he comes face to face with Damian Robin and Nightwing, he takes out Nightwing in one move, and although Robin actually puts up a really good fight, Heretic still runs him through with a massive sword, bringing the end for Batman's son. Number 4. Vampire Batman. When Dracula comes to Gotham, a good vampire grants Batman the vampiric gift in order to take on Dracula himself. And the idea was so awesome that it became a whole brutal trilogy. Starting with Red Rain, then Bloodstorm, and ending in Batman Crimson Mist. All of which put the most obvious hero to become a vampire in one of the best Victorian horror styles, and with the most terrifying looks I have ever seen for the Dark Knight. In the first novel, Red Rain, the hero wipes out the vampires and Dracula, although he is transformed into a vampire himself at the end, which means we get to see Batman take on crime using the powers of a vampire in the next novel, Bloodstorm. He does his bestest to resist the darker aspects of being a vampire, but that all goes south when Batman lashes out and drains the Joker's blood after the Joker ended the life of Catwoman. Batman has Alfred and Gordon stake him through the heart, putting Batman into a catatonic state. A state that he is then revived from in Batman Crimson Mist, when criminals took over Gotham in his absence. This time around, the Vampire Knight is almost completely animalistic now thanks to his isolation. A bloodthirsty vampire Batman quickly wipes out most of his enemies in brutal form, drinking their blood in the process until he is finally put to rest by Alfred, Gordon, Two-Face, and Killer Croc, who all go with him to the grave. Number 3. Arkham Asylum. One of the great things about Batman compared to any other hero is the way his comics can lean really heavily on the darker aspects of human beings, and because of that they can also get away with much more expressionistic art that can be really gorgeous while also being completely terrifying. As example, let's talk about Arkham Asylum. The gritty gothic artwork, which looks like it came straight out of my nightmares, meshes with the extremely dark, disturbing, supernatural themes of the story to take what is essentially just Batman going to work to secure Arkham Asylum into a brutal, mind-twisting funhouse ride. It's terrifying. Batman takes on some of his most well-known foes, but the fights aren't the compelling part. It's the sheer freakiness of it all. The real brutality of this story comes in its horror and the dark past of Arkham Asylum itself, which is slowly drip-fed to us as we make our way through the pages and pages of the most terrifying Joker I have ever seen. In at number 2, All-Star Batman. Remember before when I said that Batman puts the most brutal beatdowns on his opponents? Well, let's talk about a group of thugs in the All-Star Batman and Robin series, specifically issue number 7. Written by Frank Miller, we can expect that this Batman will be a little bit rougher around the edges, but I don't think any of us ever expected him to be like this. In fact, this whole series is full of brutal Batman moments that honestly make him feel like a totally different character. I have talked about this before, and thank you Rodney for informing me of this, but in the opening pages of issue number 7, Batman comes speeding into a group of armed thugs, foot first, laughing like the Joker and talking in his head about how Gotham is full of cockroaches. He's basically delighted at the fact that the criminals are so scared that they are accidentally disposing of each other. But then, on top of all of that, he sets fire to a bottle of bleach and tosses it onto the criminals, blanketing them in fire. And then he continues beating the snot out of them while they're getting crispy. This is no longer the Batman. There's no way, but wait, there's more. Because Black Canary then pops up out of nowhere and these two superheroes just start making out and getting busy while the thugs are barbecuing in the background. It's messed up. And finally, in at number 1, his parents. Everyone and their moms knew this was going to be on the list. It's the whole reason Batman is Batman. The tragic passing of Thomas and Martha Wayne at the hands of Joe Chill remains the defining moment in Batman's life. It's brought up so often that you think it's basically his whole personality, and in a way, it actually kinda is. The loss of his parents has informed almost everything he has done going forward, from his decision to even become Batman, to the fact that he has such weird father-child relationships with his wards. He has paid multiple visits to Joe Chill to try and teach the man the error of his ways, and to show him what he created. He's almost constantly reminded of their loss, if not by villains who know the truth, then by his own Bat family. Bruce Wayne may have grown up to become one of the greatest detectives and superheroes in the world, but he will pretty much always just be the scared little boy in an alleyway mourning the loss of his parents. And that sucks.
Number 10. Invincible vs. Conquest. Goodness. Invincible has a slew of fights that are extremely brutal and brilliant. I mean, their brutality is a huge part of what makes them so brilliant. This is a series that knows and understands the importance of creating stakes, both physical and emotional ones, for its characters. While I considered talking about the fight between Mark and his dad Omni-Man on the first part of this list, or honestly any of the other amazing fights that happen in Invincible, to be honest, as I said, there are so many, I would like to specifically thank Vaughn Soso for suggesting this one. This is the fight that happens between Conquest and Invincible. When Conquest first arrives on Earth and demands that Invincible take responsibility as the Viltrumite liaison stationed there to basically get the planet ready for conquering. Mark at this point has just gone through hell and back and basically blames himself for all of the terrible things that have happened on Earth recently. So he's not really in a great mood and is filled with anger, resentment, and sadness for all that he's lost, and decides to take on Conquest. Overall, honestly, not a great move, which Mark learns once he finds out just how powerful Conquest is. Probably one of the toughest enemies he's ever faced at this point, which is kind of par for the course for Invincible, because I feel like every time Mark faces someone, he's like, well, I've done a lot of things, and then he's always like, dang, how is this person even more powerful? How is that possible? Honestly, it's saying something, because at this point in the story, Mark has faced like a lot of tough opponents, including a whole army made up of evil versions of himself. The fight gets even more brutal when Adam Eve comes in to help, having literally flown up off a hospital bed where she was currently healing herself to do so. And I know what you all are thinking, wow, Amanda, what a number 10 spot. This is a crazy fight. But yeah, that's all part of the drawing you in, because we got a lot more crazy fights coming up, even though this one might actually be one of our craziest. But wait for that number 1 spot, that one's wild. Number 9, Deadpool vs. Black Box and Black Tom. I still can't believe how close Deadpool came to dying in this fight, and the real crazy part is it wasn't even the villains really who put him in that situation. They were more like the catalysts for him putting himself in danger as he fought against them both. This one comes to us from Daniel Way's run on Deadpool, which happened back in 2008. Here at one point Deadpool becomes cured of his mutation. With his healing factor gone, he is turned back into handsome Wade Wilson, but at the same time a big target is of course placed on his head when those he has royally pissed off in the past basically realize he's now very killable. Two people who end up coming for him are the villains Black Box and Black Tom, and to fight their fire, Deadpool decides to use some of his own fire, using literal fire, using a lighter and basically gasoline to create his own flamethrower. However, while he wins the fight, or while he survives the fight at least, I mean, I would call it a win for Deadpool here, he ends up pretty badly injured after setting himself on fire during it. He gets a little too excited with that sort of gas station flamethrower he made, and also you shouldn't do that at a gas station, as we learned in that comic. Number 8, Superboy Prime vs. The Darkest Knight. This one is brutal in a way that pulls at my heartstrings. This fight happens in the comic Dark Knight's Death Metal: The Secret Origins. While the fight itself is pretty short, the emotional and character building implications for it are powerful. The emotional stakes here are high. Superboy Prime ends up facing off against the Darkest Knight in the hopes of defeating him and helping to basically save the multiverse. Now, while he doesn't completely succeed here, he does help turn the tides for his fellow heroes, and this story provides a great redemption arc for Superboy Prime, who was once a hero, basically turned into a massive villain, all because he suffered the heartache of losing his world. While facing off against the Darkest Knight, Superboy Prime is basically offered to be spared and even join up with the Knight's own army of Supermen. He sees a vision of a life he could have in the future where he is once more a hero, fighting alongside his other heroic colleagues if he decides to, join up with the Darkest Knight, who can give him that reality. However, he acknowledges that this would still not be the world he lost, noting that both his parents and Laurie would still be absent here. Tempted, Superboy is grounded in reality suddenly by the reappearance of Crypto, and ends up refusing the offer, fighting against the Darkest Knight and giving his life in doing so. While the battle is not finished yet, this is a crucial moment where the tides turn for our heroes, weakening the darkness and allowing the heroes to basically rise rise up and end up winning the day. It is then confirmed that Superboy Prime did indeed die as a result of fighting back. However, he either gets his world back through his journey into the afterlife, or possibly through the multiverse's reconstruction following the resolution of death metal. So he's either dead and then he's brought back, or he's dead and he's in the afterlife and he just kind of gets a little happy ending in the afterlife. Number 7. Dazzler vs. Techmaster. One of the most brutal things you can do to a character, we all know, is not to just throw them brutally across a room into a wall, but literally throw them so forcefully that it looks like they were simply drawn sideways in a fight. Like someone took that figure and rotated it, which is what happens in this comic. And I was like, wow, you know that's bad. Look at Dazzler go, she's literally like this. That's what happened to Dazzler when she faced off against Techmaster. Well, Techmaster is very much, I would say, a lesser known villain, having only appeared in about a handful of issues during his time in the comics. This fight still personally had me on the edge of my seat. Honestly, a lot of classic stories have me on the edge of my seat. I just feel like the suspense just feels so heightened. While Dazzler usually pulls out all her bells and whistles in a fight, in this one she has her special portable radio made by Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic of the Fantastic Four, destroyed, and ultimately it comes down to basically kind of like fisticuffs as Dazzler fights desperately for survival here. She does win and even almost causes the death of her opponent as he tumbles backwards and falls over a railing. However, her manager, Harry Osgood, manages to rush in at the last minute and save the villain from certain doom, and with his life saved, Techmaster basically decides to make peace with both his rival Harry and with Harry's talent, Alison Blair. So it all kind of works out in the end. Number 6. Batman vs. Reverse Flash. This fight was heart-wrenching for so many reasons, and pretty much perfectly encapsulates the kind of fights I'm excited to highlight here on this list, let me tell you. In Batman issue number 21 from the 2016 comic, part of the Button story, Batman is forced to fight against an enemy who pretty much completely outranks him, the Reverse Flash. We see him get brutally attacked, and while it seems like there is no way Batman can win here, we later learn that being the smart man that he is, Batman himself knew that, and so he'd kind of already won, simply by accepting the fact that if he fought directly, he would lose, and knowing that his best bet would actually be basically to stall until the Flash returned, which ended up being a successful and life-saving strategy actually. Although I mean, in the end the Flash was still a little late, but it worked out, so yeah, and it was brutal, so it ranks. Number 5. Punisher vs. Wolverine. I mean, these two are both superheroes, which is maybe what makes the fight so much more brutal. This one happened during Garth Ennis's and Derek Robertson's time on Punisher. Here Punisher and Wolverine end up in a kind of a reluctant team up, or a team up gone wrong I would say, when Wolverine questions Punisher's methods here. As a result, to prevent Wolverine from hunting him down, or at least to kind of like slow Wolverine down because you know, it's pretty unkillable, Punisher resorts to all kinds of brutal tactics, including shooting Wolverine point blank in the face with a shotgun, allowing him to have his limbs basically sawed off, attacking him below the belt, and steamrolling him. Literally he got steamrolled. He got a steamroller and he ran Wolverine over. Boy. Wolverine of course survives all this mistreatment, but it's still a brutal read, and it's brutal in like a lot of ways to me. Definitely a brutal fight. Number 4. Batman vs. the Joker. During the events of Endgame, no, not the Marvel Endgame, the comic story from Batman Endgame, Joker and Batman essentially end up trying to straight up murder one another, or at least from a reader standpoint, that's basically what it seems like. Well, Joker at this point boasts of a healing factor that he claims he received hundreds of years before due to him being like basically this ancient being, far more ancient than Batman could have ever imagined. It's revealed through the course of their fight that, you know, this is probably not true, as Batman ends up successfully nullifying Joker's abilities in a way that reveals he only recently probably stumbled upon these powers and is definitely not as old as he claims and is just trying to mess with Batman, which honestly is the Joker way. Number 3. Conan vs. Cool & Goth. Just when you think Conan is going to take this one, the script gets flipped on you. This fight comes to us from Savage Avengers issue number 25, so good. Here, Cool & Goth faces off against Conan, who has come back to battle this fiend with the help of Kang. So you would think, with the impressive arsenal Kang has at his fingertips, that Conan would have this, right? Well, this is Cool & Goth, probably at his most powerful. He is the ruler of the world here, and even though Conan manages to maim him, he's not able to defeat him in hand-to-sorcery combat in this issue. Though of course there is a greater plan at work here, which ends up balancing the scales in Conan's favor in the end, but during this issue we don't really get to see that. Instead we focus on this bloody and gruesome battle fought with magic, energy weapons, armor, swords, symbiotes, and sharp fingernails. deadly sharp, if I may add. Number 2, Superman vs. Doomsday. Superman and Doomsday have an iconic fight that many of us know from the famous story Death of Superman. Now, if you've already watched my part 1 to this list, then this fight actually might remind you of another one I talked about over there. And if you haven't watched part 1 yet, be sure to do that after you finish this video, because we have even more brutal superhero fights waiting for you over there. And if you have already watched it, you can guess below which fight I'm referring to as to which one is kind of similar to this Superman vs. Doomsday fight. In this fight, Superman gives up his life to basically defeat Doomsday. This works with Doomsday perishing alongside Superman, ushering in the mourning period that would follow for Earth's greatest hero. But while there were those who could not believe what they were reading at the time that this story came out, this shocking moment at least would not end up being quite so frighteningly permanent, with Clark Kent later being resurrected. Even when you go back and read this, it's very powerful, it's very emotional. Number 1, Miracle Man vs. Kid Miracle Man. Whew! This is a brutal one. Thanks to Michael Lavender for suggesting this one in the comments. I honestly do not think of Miracle Man often enough in my day-to-day. When I'm talking about comics, the Miracle Man is something that exists sort of near the back of my mind. So thank you so much for suggesting this one, because now I get to talk about Miracle Man, which is just a great time. Talk about a character and a story and a fight. Rather, this one is honestly more of a massacre by the end. Less of a fight, more of just a brutal massacre. It's true that this is probably one of the most brutal superhero fights in all of comics history, I would say. And I'm actually sad that I didn't include this on my part 1, but you know what? It doesn't have to be the most brutal, it just had to be some brutal fights. So it's still good, and now we can come back to it over here and I can give it a top spot. We're going back to issue number 15 of Miracle Man to talk about this one from the 80s, although it was also reprinted in 2014, so if you see it looking a little bit more modern here, it might just be because we used that art in this video instead, which is actually also from Toddleben, so it's same artist, just they also redid it. And I would still say that I think this story has some of the most captivating and gruesome artwork I've ever seen in a comic, courtesy of Toddleben himself. In this tragic tale, Miracle Man is forced to fight against his former sidekick, Kid Miracle Man, who is now all grown up. Well, at least his Kid Miracle Man form is. Having lived in this form for years, he aged and also became insane. After transforming back into his human form of Johnny Bates initially after years of being Kid Miracle Man, who was now an adult and was basically crazed with power, he was traumatized to learn of all the horrible things that he had done in that form. So he was put into an orphanage with the hopes that, being around other kids his age might help him to drown out the voice of Kid Miracle Man that still plagued his mind and was kind of living in there. However, after being tormented by the other kids and suffering from SA, Johnny ended up saying the magical name of Miracle Man, transforming back into Kid Miracle Man and unleashing him on the world. Thousands, 40,000 people were killed in the massacre that ensued after this transformation, and in the end, Miracle Man got lucky when Kid Miracle Man was forced to say the magical word once more to escape the pain of the injuries he'd suffered in battle. Also, this battle, I should admit, took pretty much everyone to even just get him to turn back, so that's wild. Knowing that there was likely no way to save Johnny from his evil alter ego, and therefore no way to prevent this kind of awful massacre from happening again, potentially in the future, Miracle Man was then forced to offer Johnny a sense of comfort, holding Johnny's head before he basically crushes it in his hand. I have trauma just from reliving the story and rereading it.
Number 10, Rorschach. Walter Kovacs had a pretty rough upbringing, being raised by a less than ideal mother before being made a ward of the state. He was bullied there too, although through his schooling it was discovered that he was an extremely intelligent boy with a real skill at boxing. When he grew up, he became a garment worker until the murder of a woman who was killed in front of several witnesses, who all didn't even try to help her, inspired him to become a costumed crime fighter. He used a special fabric that changed with temperature and pressure to make a mask for himself, and he became Rorschach. Rorschach was a decently respected hero, even working with the other heroes as a member of the hero team the Crime Busters. But after seeing a particularly cruel and disturbing crime scene, his mind snapped, and the Walter Kovacs side of him died, leaving only the brutal Rorschach. Rorschach has been known to treat the criminal element with complete disdain and cruelty, having no qualms about using intense violence in his interrogations, like when he crushed a drinking glass in a man's hands. He is lethal to his enemies, having dropped men down elevator shafts, set men on fire, burned them with cooking oil, electrocuted them, and drowned them in toilets without showing the slightest bit of remorse. Number 9, Wolverine. You know who Wolverine is. He's the fuzzy Canadian with a healing factor who was experimented on by the Weapon X program and given adamantium claws. He has been a member of several superhero teams such as the X-Men, X-Force, and the Avengers, but he is much more brutal than a lot of his teammates. I mean, he has knives coming out of his hands. That obviously makes him pretty brutal, but considering this, he does try to restrain himself from being too violent. Unfortunately for his enemies, he has a tendency to fly into a berserker rage where he becomes a flurry of claws and anger. I could sit here and tell you specific examples of his brutality, but pretty much all of them just boil down to him using his claws to leave rooms full of corpses that have been cut into a bunch of tiny pieces. Number 8. Spawn. Al Francis Simmons was a mercenary for the US government before being killed by one of his fellow mercenaries. Due to all the murder, Al was sent to Hell, but he made a deal with a demon named Malebolgia and agreed to join Hell's army as a Hellspawn. He was sent back to Earth, where he discovered that 5 years had passed and that his wife had remarried and started a new life with his best friend. So he became Spawn and spent the rest of his time brutally dispatching violent criminals and fighting evil demons. He can use his demonic powers to go up against his enemies, but he is just as likely to use his bare hands to straight up tear people in half, or in one case, stab someone to death with an ice cream scoop. Number 7. Dog Welder. Dog Welder is a member of the DC Super Team Section 8, which consists of some of the intentionally worst superheroes in comic book history. There is Six-Pack, who is a drunk man who attacks people with a bottle, Defenestrator, who carries around a window pane that he breaks over people's heads, or Bueno Excelente, who, well, the less said about him the better. One of the more brutal members of this lame team is the Dog Welder. He never speaks, and his whole deal is setting up traps in alleyways to capture and euthanize dogs. He then carries around the dead dogs until he comes across a villain. Then he uses his welding torch to weld the dog to the villain's face. That's it. That's his whole deal. And he has only made 6 appearances in the history of DC, although in one of them he did weld a dog to Lobo's butt. Number 6. Moon Knight. When Mark Spector was a child, he discovered that his rabbi was actually a former German SS officer who had deserted at the end of the war and was posing as a rabbi in order to end the lives of members of the local Jewish community. Mark escaped, but the trauma of this caused him to develop dissociative identity disorder. His first alters were Stephen Grant, who invested Mark's meager funds and became a millionaire who funds their superhero activities, and Jake Lockley, a rough and tumble cabbie who uses his position to gather intel on the various crimes going on. Mark became a mercenary, and after having been critically injured, made a deal with the god Khonshu to become his fist and punish evildoers in his name. He developed the superhero personas of Moon Knight as well as Mr. Knight, who is also a hero but wears a posh white suit rather than a big white cloak. Moon Knight can be brutal with his enemies, often branding them with his logo or straight up killing them. Some of his worst moments include gouging the villain Truth's eyes out, or ending his battle with Raoul Bushman by cutting off the guy's face. Number 5. Homelander. The result of Vought American's Compound V experiments, Homelander is a narcissistic psychopath with all the powers of Superman, and is considered the most powerful man alive in the boys' universe. While he is the antagonist of both the comics and the series, he is technically a superhero, even if in occupation only. Homelander is extremely powerful, but considers himself above humanity, and thinks himself invincible, often using his powers to horrifically kill people who get in his way, annoy him, or even just happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time when Homelander is bored. Some of his more brutal murders include him dooming an entire airplane filled with civilians, taking off the vice president's head, and in one issue, flying a family and their car into the sky before dropping it. He is probably the most sadistic character on this list, but since he is only considered a superhero by technicality, I put him right in the middle of the list. Number 4. Lobo. Although this space bounty hunter is more often villainous than heroic, his time on the Justice League makes me comfortable giving him a spot on this list. Lobo is the last of his own species because he destroyed everyone else in what he called a science project. He gave himself an A, by the way. In his years of bounty hunting, he has destroyed several planets and countless lives, and has shown little in the way of remorse. Like Homelander, he is on this list near the middle because though he has technically operated as a superhero, there is very little about him that is actually heroic. Number 3. Ghost Rider. Johnny Blaze is a motorcycle stuntman who, in an effort to save his surrogate father Crash Simpson from dying of cancer, made a deal with the demon Mephisto. Mephisto promised to cure Crash's cancer in exchange for Johnny's services. Unfortunately, Crash perished in a stunt gone wrong almost immediately afterwards, and Johnny became Ghost Rider, becoming bound to the spirit of vengeance, Zarathos. When transformed into the Rider, he has super strength, is essentially immune to damage, and can manipulate hellfire. Perhaps most iconic is his penance stare, which causes its victims to experience every bit of pain they have ever inflicted on other people, resulting in guilt, pain, and trauma. In one of the most brutal examples of the penance stare's power, Ghost Rider used it on a man who then broke his own neck with his bare hands to end the pain. Number 2. The Punisher. Frank Castle was a Marine whose family was killed in the crossfire of a mob attack. Frank survived but was deeply traumatized, and when his family's killers went free due to police corruption, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He became the Punisher and began using his military skills and tactics to wage a brutal one-man war on crime. His extreme methods have brought him into frequent conflict with both the villains and the heroes of the Marvel Universe. Frank has no personal life to speak of, and tends to avoid friendships in general, choosing to spend all of his time plotting, hunting, or killing criminals. He is a lunatic with nothing to lose, but fortunately for the good people of the Marvel Universe, all of his insane fury is directed at the criminals of the city. Some of his more brutal kills include feeding a man to polar bears at the zoo, using his obese friend to smother the Russian, or kicking a limbless crime boss into a raging fire. Number 1. The Spectre. The spirit of vengeance in the DC universe first appeared in More Fun Comics number 52. He was originally a demon called Aztar, who was helping Lucifer try and take control of heaven. He eventually had a change of heart and surrendered to the Archangel Michael. As a means of atonement, his memory and consciousness were wiped, and he was transformed into the Spectre. He is a divinely powered being capable of almost anything he can imagine, can travel between dimensions, and can shoot energy blasts. He's immortal and capable of flight, intangibility, possession, telepathy, and telekinesis, just to name a few of his powers. In order to temper this power, he must be bonded to a human host, with this most often being Jim Corrigan. Spectre has no limit to his power, but is bound by the morality of the host, who often prevents him from unleashing the full wrath of God upon his enemies. He has killed people by aging them to death, melting them, cutting them in half with giant scissors, turning a man into a sentient and feeling mannequin who was then dumped in a fire and painfully burnt. He turned a bunch of junkies into his fingertips and then injected them with liquid fire, and in one extreme case, burnt down an entire country.